for bearing with me and bearing with us. I know it's getting late, but this is going to be an exciting and important discussion. So thank you so much. I'm Jared Anderson. I'm an independent energy analyst and journalist, and we're going to be talking about climate change and the upcoming Paris negotiations today. So when I took environmental politics as part of my undergraduate studies at the University of Oregon, let's go Ducks, get rich and then green was a popular concept. The idea being that the developed economies of the world, with their strong institutions and environmental regulations, had to go through the Industrial Revolution to get there. And they got to the other side and they looked around and they said, oh my goodness, our natural systems are devastated. I can't see my hand in front of my face. We have to do something. This form of development is unsustainable. So the EPAs of the world were formed and they started regulating pollution. It could be argued a similar process is going on in the world's developing economies, where they're going through their own industrial revolutions of sorts, and it can be difficult when populations are struggling to access food and electricity and water and healthcare. It's understandable that environmental concerns can sometimes take a back seat. Climate change, however, alters that calculus, and there's real urgency around this issue. The relative wealth of a nation is arguably less in a world gripped by the most dangerous impacts of climate change, and climate's not an issue that can be addressed after the fact, as some environmental issues have been. So that's why this is such an exciting time, and hopefully a pivotal moment in the ongoing climate change story. The 21st Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is taking place next month in Paris. And that's what we're here to talk about. That journey started in 1992 in Rio, when the UNFCCC was originally formed, came into force in 1994, and subsequent COP meetings, Conference of Party meetings, produced things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Montreal Protocol. But arguably Paris is the most important meeting to date, because the parties seek to negotiate a binding international agreement to address climate change and prevent global temperatures from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius. Now, that is a daunting challenge, and I both envy and pity the folks who will be strapping in around the finest French conference tables for these marathon negotiations. And I envy them for the important work that they'll be doing, work that hopefully leaves a historic mark. But clearly, this is difficult. It's going to be a long road to hoe, and so we're thankful for the determination of these negotiators, and we really do wish them the best of luck. But what we need to be looking at and thinking about now are questions like, what might a successful outcome look like? What are the criteria that, after these negotiations, we look back and say that we've reached a successful agreement? What are INDCs? And why can I never remember what that acronym stands for? Just kidding, I got it now. And how are these countries going to finance these efforts? So these are things that we'll be discussing today on this panel with these esteemed experts. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them now. And then they're going to give some introductory remarks. And we'll have a discussion, and we'll open it up for questions. So to my right is Eliza Northrop. And she's a research analyst for the International Climate Action Initiative with World Resources Institute. World Resources Institute, apologies. She's an attorney whose work focuses primarily on advancing equity and development in the international climate negotiations and national level climate policies, as well as identifying linkages between climate and development policy in multiple arenas, including UN development and finance processes. Eliza also coordinates the cross-institute efforts focusing on the 2015 climate agreement. Prior to joining WRI, Eliza acted as legal advisor to the permanent mission of the Kingdom of Tonga to the UN during the 68th session of the General Assembly. And Eliza previously worked as a negotiator and policy advisor for the South Australian Department of Environment, Water, and Natural Resources. And we have Kevin Massy. He is an analyst of energy and geopolitics, covering the impact of U.S. foreign and environmental policy on Statoil's global business. He is the international government relations force for Statoil in Washington, D.C. He's a former fellow at Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy Program, focused on U.S. and international energy policy. And previously an analyst at the UK Foreign Office, and separately a stringer for The Economist. And on my far right is Granger Morgan. He is the Hamerschlag University Professor of Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. He holds appointments in 3 academic units: the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and the John Hines III College. His research addresses problems in science, technology, and public policy with a particular focus on energy, environmental systems, climate change, the adoption of new technologies, and risk analysis. Much of his work. The work has involved the development and demonstration of methods to characterize and treat uncertainty in quantitative policy analysis. At Carnegie Mellon, Morgan co-directs the NSF Center for Climate and Energy Decision-Making and the university's Electricity Industry Center. Morgan serves as a chair of the Scientific and Technical Council for the International Risk Governance Council. He's a member of DOE's Electricity Advisory Committee and of the Energy Advisory Committee at PNNL. So we're clearly in good hands for this discussion here today. And now I will let Eliza make some opening remarks.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully I provide some light policy relief to the very in-depth discussions that I think you've been having yesterday and today. So I just wanted to start very quickly by giving some background as to why WRI works in this space, why I work in this space, and where we see the international negotiations going, as well as touch on some of the information and some of the work that WRI has been doing in INDC to sort of provide some of the context for some of the questions that might come a bit later on. So things are heating up, we know this. Last 15 years have been the hottest on record since 1997. Global emissions are rising, they're not peaking yet. And just to give you background on some of these, WRI is a research institute. We love data, we love graphics. So. And sort of the state of play heading into these negotiations, the global top 10 emitters account for 72.78% of total greenhouse gas emissions. This is huge. I think you can see them there, I'll read them out. China, the US, the EU as a group, India, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, and Iran. And a different picture as well, which brings a different set of players into some of these negotiations, are top 10 emitters per capita. Again, some of the similar players, but also different: Canada, the US, Russia, Japan, Brazil, EU, Indonesia, China, Mexico, and India as well. So that's sort of the emissions data or the background that leads us to why we're negotiating a new international climate agreement at the end of this year, and why we've been working so hard this year to reach agreement. This is a universal climate agreement. All parties, we're trying to reach agreement between all parties and get all parties on board. And I think for us at WRI, we firmly believe that whatever the outcome in Paris, efforts to shape international climate policy and the politics that surround that will need to be strategically shifted, and will be strategically shifted in 2006 as a result. And that whatever agreement we reach in Paris represents this pivot point. Paris is not the end. I think, you know, a lot of the narrative the year 2-3 years ago was about getting to Paris, and we were going to get this new agreement in Paris, and this is going to solve all our problems. I think we know that Paris is just an important point along the way. It needs to set the signal. It needs to be that pivot point, and I think it's really shaping up to do that, which is very promising. We also think, we at WRI see that the agreement needs to play sort of 7 core functions, and this is how we've gone about our work over the last couple of years. It needs to send a clear signal that the low carbon economy is inevitable. It needs to connect this global agreement to the real economy and to real people. It needs to provide transparency and accountability around emissions, around support, around actions, commitments. Critically, it needs to accelerate investment in low carbon and climate resilient economies. It needs to build a basis for climate action that demonstrates fairness. Ensure that vulnerable have the capacity to build resilience and adapt to the impacts that we cannot mitigate against. And it needs to link to science with a sense of urgency. So a lot of the work that WRI has done has actually been to sort of look at what are the core elements of this new agreement. We have developed policy recommendations based on convenings and discussions we've had with countries all around the world, and actually put those together into sort of a draft agreement that we released earlier this year. But essentially what it has, and this is actually how the agreement looks like it's shaping up, and I can talk more to this later, but it's essentially looking at the three main components: mitigation, adaptation, and support. And by support, we're not only mentioning finance, but as capacity building and technology. And sort of a continuing cycle of improvement, cycle of ambition around all three core pillars or core elements of the agreement. The sort of overarching equity narrative that runs through all of that. Global goal to build resilience, to adapt, as well as a global goal to sort of phase out GHG emissions to net zero, but there's a number of different framings of a long-term goal that are important. Just wanted to put this slide up there because this is something that we had sort of identified earlier this year as three likely outcomes. One where no agreement is reached and everything is sort of set back. One where we get agreement, but it's very vague. It doesn't include some of the core elements that we'd like to see. And the third option, which is where we really wanted to send this and where all of our work was pushing towards, is a much stronger agreement, very clear, long-term goals, a process where everyone comes back and improves at regular intervals, clarity around finance, and engagement at, right through from the heads of state through to media. I think we're actually seeing the third outcome so far. So I think that's why I just wanted to touch on this, is that we're not really in this space anymore where we're wondering what's going to be the outcome. I think we are clearly seeing that we're headed towards the stronger outcome that we hoped for a year ago. And then there's this sort of road from Paris that I mentioned. This is not the end. This is just a checkpoint, if you like. What's going to happen next year? Countries will continue to develop and adopt their nationally determined contributions. At this point, that's likely to continue to include both mitigation and adaptation components. Countries will continue to do national adaptation planning and processes. Other national climate strategies will be developed and implemented. There'll be this next cycle of increasing ambition, as well as the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that were formally adopted by the General Assembly last month. So that's sort of the agreement and the work that we've been doing around the agreement and what we see as the critical elements of that moving forward. One of the other things that I think this session wanted to touch on is this concept of INDCs, Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, and that has been a core focus of both WRI's work this year as well as my own. And I just wanted to highlight some of the sort of quick facts for those of you that don't work in this all the time. You might not know the extent of this that's been happening. One of the many tools that WRI has is an online dashboard, if you like, that tracks the INDCs submitted, or has been tracking this year as they're submitted. They are now pretty much all submitted. And includes key data around the different mitigation components, the level of transparency, adaptation, equity. So it's a really useful resource to anyone that's interested. Got some quick facts. As of today, 127 INDCs have been submitted. Of these, 113 are from developing countries. This is unprecedented. This is what I was talking about when we really mean that this is a universal agreement. Everyone is involved. And all of these INDCs address mitigation in very different ways, but they all address mitigation. And again, all of these maps are available on the CATE website, just showing the different types of targets and the different ways that countries have gone about putting forward their mitigation contribution. And lastly, I mentioned, or I have mentioned a lot, the importance of adaptation. We're not only talking about mitigation this time around. 85% of INDCs submitted have included an adaptation component. So talking about adaptation needs, priorities, plans, or processes that country is currently undertaking. So that's my quick INDC snapshot and introduction. I'll pass over.
All right, and I'd like to invite Kevin up.
Thank you, Jared. Good afternoon. And thank you to USAEE and IAEE for the invitation to participate in the discussion. I think it's probably a good idea that Eliza went first because a lot of what she focused on, I think, is the core and the essence of the COP21 discussion. You might be wondering what an oil and gas company representative is here talking about COP21 for. That's a good question. In his introduction, Jared said that I cover international affairs for Statoil based in Washington, and my day job, or the reason I was hired, was to focus on security issues, trade issues, and US foreign policy and how it affects our operations and our investments overseas. But increasingly, I am focusing more and more time on the issue of climate and environment and sustainability. For oil and gas companies, and particularly for our company, this is a critical issue, and one that we have to engage with, and one that consumes a lot of our thinking. I'm not here to second guess the policy process in Paris or to really put forward any forthright recommendations for what the intergovernmental process should or can achieve. I will give you an outline of kind of what we as Statoil would like to see come out of Paris. But mainly, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the things that we are doing as a company and increasingly as an industry to complement and supplement the intergovernmental process and the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to a level below the concentrations necessary to keep the 2-degree scenario. I just got back last week from Norway. Statoil, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a Norwegian oil and gas company. It is two-thirds owned by the Norwegian government, but it operates very much as a private profit and loss IOC. We have operations in 35 countries. We produce about 2 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent a day. We're the second largest supplier of gas to Europe after Gazprom, and we have significant investments here in the US. I saw our CEO unveil our new vision on kind of how he envisages taking Statoil into the future. And climate and sustainability were very much part of that. In fact, they were one of the three central pillars of the vision. I think we as a company are slightly unusual in that we have a constituency in Norway that is very engaged on the climate issue. We have a government that is very engaged on the climate issue. And while we are a private company and operate along the same metrics as any other listed oil and gas company, we also carry with us the expectations of Norwegian society. And so it is our responsibility, we feel, to engage on the question of climate in a serious way and not as a side issue. We are not going to have a large presence in Paris. I mean, that is, as Eliza outlined, a forum for governments to work out a framework in which companies like ours can operate. But we will have a low-level presence there, and we have been engaged in side dialogues and ancillary and supplementary discussions around the ambition in Paris. Some of our core messages are that the science of man-made climate change is real. We accept the science without question, and we accept that the 2-degree scenario is achievable, and we think it can be done. We, like many other oil and gas companies, put out an annual kind of outlook or forecast of how the energy sector globally will evolve over a certain number of years. Ours goes to 2040. Ours is called Energy Perspectives. And this year we did something different than we usually do. We usually look at GDP growth and existing trends and technology and assumptions around efficiency and kind of project out where we think the world will end up at a certain date, 2040. We did that across 2 scenarios, and then our third scenario, which we called renewal, this year we reverse engineered it to get to a 2-degree scenario, and force the system to arrive at a 2-degree snenario. There are many ways that you can do that, and as a theoretical exercise, we challenged ourselves by forcing oil out of the transportation sector to the extent feasible. And I recommend you read it. But that would be a painful pathway for a company like ours. But we go through these thought experiments and these scenario plans, and we believe that there is a path to a 2-degree scenario. We are clearly seeing a transition to a low-carbon future. As a company, in the last year, we've had a new CEO. We've also restructured in a way to take account of the changing nature of the global energy landscape and the low carbon and the carbon constrained nature of it. We launched a new division called New Energy Solutions, which looks to expand our portfolio outside of oil and gas into low carbon and zero carbon investments and technologies. The principal areas in this respect so far are offshore wind, which we're involved in Norway and Scotland and looking elsewhere to expand, and CCS. And I'll come back to CCS in a minute. But our approach has been one of being a constructive partner, of being proactive in discussions with stakeholders, both industry stakeholders, civil society stakeholders and government stakeholders. A main gas supplier. As I mentioned, we're a large gas supplier in Europe, and coal to gas switching, we believe, is a near-term opportunity for emissions reductions that is real and achievable. We're also attempted to be, and I'll show you in a minute, the number of initiatives and organisations and partnerships that we're a member of, but we've attempted to lead the discussion from the oil and gas sector on carbon efficiency, flaring avoidance, methane emissions reductions, and being a responsible producer of oil and gas. As I mentioned, we're complementing the oil and gas portfolio with a new energy solutions business unit. And we have worked in the past and continue to work with the public and private sector partners to deploy CCS. Statoil has sequestered more carbon than any other company or than any other entity in the world. We've been sequestering carbon for nearly 20 years on the Norwegian continental shelf. And so we have some experience with the technology that we are hoping to share and scale up in the years ahead. We do have messages for government at a macro level. We think that we need ambitious targets in all countries. We need a level playing field when it comes to incentivizing low carbon investment, technology neutrality, and non-discriminatory measures we think are the best way to get there, as is a price on carbon. Our CEO was one of 6 European oil and gas CEOs that signed a letter to the UNFCCC earlier this year calling for a price on carbon globally, and that has generated a lot of interest, but has also generated a lot of questions about how you get there and what that means. So this is a slide that shows some of the initiatives that we are part of: the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Program through the World Bank, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which is a UN environment program administered initiative to reduce short-lived climate forces, including methane, and a number of other organizations and partnerships, including some on pricing carbon and emissions trading. I won't go into them all at this at this point. The LCTPI is one that I will talk about. It's a World Bank administered program to bring business into the discussion and to develop the expertise and the competence that the private sector has in addressing the challenge of reduced carbon emissions. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative was established in 2014 and was initially launched at the UN Climate Summit in 2014. It's now a year old. You see the members there, but the striking thing is that they're not just European IOCs. We have Pemex and Reliance from India and Saudi Aramco. This is an energy, oil and gas coalition that has decided to step forward and try to take a more positive and constructive approach to the COP21 process and generally the issue of climate. And there are a number of commitment areas and focus areas, including efficiency in our own production and operations, an effort to increase the amount of natural gas, coal to gas switching in major economies, a focus on R&D and particularly in CCS, and a focus on energy access. I won't go into this in too much detail or depth, but this is the Low Carbon Technology Partnership that I mentioned. It's administered by the World Bank Center on Sustainable Development. Here are some of the companies in it, the 140 companies or so, and they are all leaning forward to try to bring technical expertise and private sector management expertise to the challenge of carbon emissions reduction. One area that I'll quickly focus on is the carbon capture and storage effort. As you can see, there are many globally recognizable companies up there. We are part of this effort that is through the LCTPI to focus on CCS, particularly two work streams. One is to look at new funding models and solutions for deployment of CCS, and another is to map the CO2 storage potential globally. I can answer more questions on this if you're interested. But this is just some of the things that we are doing as a company, as an industry. We recognise that the government sets the rules of the road and the policy frameworks, but we have a role to play, and we're trying to step forward and be a constructive stakeholder. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That's some really interesting things in there that I'm looking forward to delving into a little bit more deeply. Okay. Without further ado, Granger Morgan.
Thank you. So after decades of talk, the world is finally showing signs of muddling its way towards serious policies to limit climate change. Promising developments here in the US include the switch to natural gas, the implementation of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. Internationally, the ongoing efforts of the EU, the agreement between the US and China, and efforts to limit emissions from aircraft and ocean shipping are also promising. More than half a century ago, political scientist Charles Lindblom argued that muddling through with incremental steps is frequently superior to attempting to design and implement comprehensive policy solutions. However, if climate policy is ultimately to be successful, muddling will need to be combined with some longer-term visioning. Modest first steps that reduce emissions of greenhouse gases are wonderful, but to stabilize the climate, the world must ultimately reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by roughly an order of magnitude. It's not too soon to start thinking about how to avoid getting stuck with policies that do not scale up, how to avoid regulatory lock-in, and move past the early incremental steps to achieve much deeper reductions. In the US, once the Senate failed to pass the Waxman-Markey bill that would have implemented a trading system on carbon dioxide, the White House made the perfectly sensible choice to proceed incrementally using Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. You probably all know EPA's plan. It consists of 3 building blocks. And under the US federal system, states or group of states each will develop their own implementation strategies. Hopefully, litigation won't derail this effort, and the US will achieve the EPA's goal of a 32% reduction in emissions from 2005 levels by 2030. But 32% is only a fraction of what will be needed over the coming decades. Unless approaches based on regional and national trading emerge as the dominant strategy, it could prove very challenging to overcome a complex patchwork of state-by-state regulatory solutions to move beyond that first 32%. Regulatory complexity is also emerging internationally. For example, the Committee of the International Civil Aviation Organization, a committee of the International Civil Aviation Organization has developed a straw man proposal to reduce aircraft emissions. And my colleague Parth Vaishnav has analyzed this proposed approach and finds that it is unbelievably complex, and after a few years it even fails to meet its stated objectives. If the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris in November is successful, the resulting agreement will be an important real, or at least symbolic, step. But implementation, whether it occurs through a comprehensive international agreement or through a variety of bilateral agreements, such as the recent US-China arrangements, will have to proceed nation by nation and sector by sector. 15 years ago, I argued in Science that successful global emissions reduction was far more likely to result not from a global agreement, but rather from the gradual coalescence of a number of successful regional control regimes. I titled this piece, "Managing Carbon from the Bottom Up." For that reason, I see the recent US-China agreement as especially important. At least some of these bilateral and multilateral agreements will be accomplished by muddling along incrementally. And unlike simpler schemes such as emissions fees, caps, or carbon portfolio standards, all designed to become tighter in a predictable way over time, many of the complex systems that are likely to result from difficult negotiations may complicate the achievement of future deeper emissions cuts. Once they become firmly established, complex regulatory systems and bureaucracies that have been created to enforce them, and the emergence of interest groups with a stake in continuing their operation, can be extremely difficult to change. So I'll conclude by offering 5 examples of strategies that can help to minimize the difficulties of moving on to much deeper emission reductions. You've probably all seen these diagrams that Lawrence Livermore puts out of the energy flow through the US system. The dark gray there is energy that's used in some useful way, and the light gray up above is rejected waste heat, energy that's not used for any useful purpose. So one thing, of course, is to adopt a total system perspective on energy efficiency and try to figure out if there aren't some ways you can move more of the light gray down into the dark gray. And one strategy that will allow one to do that is the use of combined heat, distributed combined heat and power, 2 examples of which are shown here. 2, support the continued operation of zero carbon energy sources. This country is shutting down nuclear plants. Why? Because we have restructured the power system and tried to make competitive markets, which are great in the short term, but the result is that because some nukes can't compete with very low-cost natural gas, we're closing them down. In a decade or so, we're going to really wish we had those plants. 3, show preference for technologies that can reduce the emissions of CO2 to zero. On the top, I've shown an amine scrubbing plant. Amine systems for CCS are great. They can't achieve 100% reduction. On the bottom, I've shown an oxy-fuel plant. They could reduce by 100%. So one ought to think a little bit about the choice of technologies and try to find technologies that can actually reach zero. Provide much more support for the development of low-carbon energy sources and efficient energy systems. We've got a lot of technologies out there which could really contribute to the process of decarbonizing the energy system, but without carbon prices or other regulatory structures in place, there's no particular reason that a private firm operating in a commercial market should make investments that may not pay off for decades. And so there's clearly a role for the federal government to expand its research in this space and help more and more of these technologies get across the valley of death. And 5, avoid future dead ends. When it's economically and technically feasible, avoid point source control strategies that aren't easily superseded in the future by simple pricing of emissions or by cap and trade. When emission fees are used, consider linking them in some way to the anticipated infrastructure lifetime. Once I get some infrastructures in place, they're there for a very long time, and develop policies based on real options to subsidize the incremental costs of the groundwork for conversions that may be needed in the future. So my bottom line is muddling through may be the best we can do in the short term in order to get started on policy to reduce CO2 emissions. However, to avoid dead ends, the community of policy analysts should begin to work now on identifying and avoiding strategies that might lead to dead ends and to find ways to promote strategies that will scale up to the more than 90% emission reductions we will need. Without some longer-term visioning of how to gracefully move past short-term strategies to address the longer-term need for major emissions reduction, progress could stall. The success of today should not become the burden of tomorrow. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. I think a good place to start the discussion would be to talk a little bit about how you guys see a successful outcome. What might that look like?
The microphone isn't on.
This one's on. You want it? That's okay.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, so I think a useful place for us to start would be to talk a little bit about what a successful outcome in Paris might look like, and maybe some of the challenges that the negotiators will face along the way. So maybe Eliza, to start.
Sure. I think I alluded to some of this in some of my opening slides. I've just gotten back from Bonn, the negotiations as well, so I am well aware of some of the challenges that the parties are currently facing, and I think will continue to face in the 4 or 5 weeks that we have left. In terms of what a successful agreement or an effective agreement would look like, from my perspective, essentially I think it needs to set out, it needs to be universal. I mentioned that earlier. It needs to have the participation of all parties. I think that is key. And fundamentally, it needs to be an agreement that sets out a process. People are calling it mechanisms, cycles, lots of different lingo, but essentially it's a process where all the countries agree to come back after a particular period of time, 5 years, and increase the ambition of their contributions. So it's trying to get at that longer term process to avoid the muddling along potential dead end that we might get to if we stop with the ambition that's seen in the current INDCs. I think there's a lot of media around this sort of the gap, the fact that the current INDCs as communicated do not achieve this 2-degree target. What are we going to do? I don't think they ever were going to. I think that's unrealistic. But that is the role of this agreement in being universally, in applying to all countries, because all countries are in the process of doing INDCs. So the role of this agreement is to set that long-term vision that can guide everyone, not just parties, but business and, well, I suppose, yeah, everyone. At the sub-regional level as well, the subnational level and regional level. But to set the process where this is just the first stage. We come back in 5 years, everyone increases what they're doing, and then increases again after 5 years and 5 years after that. And this is the process that the agreement needs to set out, in line with sort of a long-term goal or long-term vision for both mitigation and adaptation. So to me, if it does that, if it addresses the main pillars of the negotiation that I mentioned, mitigation, adaptation, finance or support, finance, capacity building and technology, if we can address all of those things, create this sort of regular cycle, I think it will have done its job. I think it will have set us on a path where our chances of success are significantly increased than where they are now. What was the second part of that? Challenges. The negotiations it's been an intense year of negotiations. I think if you've been following along in the news, we go from, hearing the text is 100 pages to 15 pages to it's ballooned again up to 55 pages or something in the current iteration. These are really complex negotiations. Trying to make the agreement universal means that there has to be a balance of issues across the agreement. This is not just about mitigation, as important as that is, but it's making sure that adaptation, making sure that vulnerable communities have the support they need to increase their resilience, making sure finance is there, or the adequate levels of finance there, the indicators for shifting the trillions. We're not just talking about a number or getting to this 100 billion mark, but this agreement needs to enable us to shift the trillions to achieve where we need to get. These are significant challenges, and we are not there yet. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, so last week was the final negotiating session before Paris. There's a pre-COP.
What was the general mood during that?
So the general mood, so we came in, to give you a bit of negotiating background, we came into this session, the co-chairs of the negotiating session, the ADP, after the last session, which was in September, had prepared, they'd been given a mandate by all the parties to prepare a new negotiating text based on the outcome of the last negotiation. So to take all the inputs and all the issues raised by all the parties and to come up with a streamlined text that the parties could actually negotiate from. So they did that. The text they came out with was 15 pages in length. They'd made a lot of decisions in that text that no one was happy with. So the negotiations started off very tense. There was a strong divide between developed and developing countries. Developing countries felt that their issues weren't reflected in this very streamlined text. So we went from a position that we had something very clear that I think anyone could understand to parties sort of opening the text up again and putting in a number of options. But I think by the end of the week, parties worked relatively hard. We got a text that reflects, is very party driven, I think they always refer to it as, but it's essentially a negotiating text where every party sees their options in the text, which for a process, a multilateral process like this, having that trust among the parties is critical. So the mood by the end was relatively positive in the sense of everyone is on board. They are just, I think everyone is overwhelmed by the amount of work that they have to do informally, sort of through bilateral channels between now and Paris. And I mentioned sort of the next critical stage between now and Paris is sort of the pre-COP, which is when key ministers come together from the 8th to the 11th of November and discuss sort of key issues around this text. And that's where we are hoping that most of sort of the very political issues that are currently reflected in the text are able to be worked through, so that the negotiators again have something, or have clearer mandates from their governments to negotiate with in Paris in the very short week of sort of actual negotiations that we'll have before the heads of state come to make the big decisions. So that, I think, is the main challenge, is get them to a point where the technical issues, the points of consensus, are resolved, and the heads of state are left with the big ticket political items that they can make calls on in that final week that gets us to an internationally legally binding agreement. So that was a long answer, but...
No, I think that's quite a challenge indeed. I hope they have some energy left when you get to Paris.
In keeping with what I said in the introduction, I don't. My answer's not going to be as long as Eliza's. I think two things. One, we would like to see an agreement that was sufficiently ambitious that kept the option, the opportunity of reaching the 2-degree scenario alive and feasible. And we would like to see, to the extent possible, an agreement that gives signals to the business community that reduces investment uncertainty. I mean, our business is one of managing risks, a lot of complex and quickly changing risks, from technological risks to geological risks to political risks. Climate risk is real, but it is unlike any other risk that we've managed before.